we're going to be talking about a difficult topic, and I do want to kind of start with, I guess, a disclaimer of sorts. When you talk about suffering, the truth is no one wants to hear about suffering while you're suffering, right? Like this is not a fun topic. I had a couple moments this week as I'm writing this sermon going, why did I ever decide to jump in on this topic? This was kind of stupid of me, but I think that it's important to have an honest conversation about suffering. And so that's what we're going to try to do this morning. I want to acknowledge also that in case you are right in the thick of it right now, some of this could sound maybe trite or a little too platitudey, as I would say, but that's not the intent. Okay, that is not the intent. Again, I just want to have an honest conversation this morning. So with all that said, don't you wish that there was some kind of limit on suffering? As if someone somewhere, they had their little scorecard or checklist there, and they were keeping track, and they could say, yeah, she has gone through a bit too much. No more for her. Or, yep, that guy, he is maxed out. Only the best things for him from now on. Unfortunately, no matter how much we want that to be true, we know that somehow everything just keeps happening. No matter how much good we do, no matter how kind we are, or no matter how much we try to create good vibes only. There is no formula that will exempt us from the realities of being human. And this lack of easy answers and formulas, quite frankly, it's hard to live in. Especially when many of us we've lost too much. We've had too much pain to bear, or it seems that the sky just continues falling in on us. The existence of suffering has been, and it remains, one of the greatest mysteries in our Christian faith. One main reason this topic continues to be perplexing to us is because we believe that God is both good and all-powerful, and yet suffering happens everywhere, every day. Ultimately, in the Christian faith, the presence of suffering, it shouts loudly our biggest questions. It's the where and the why questions. Specifically, where is God? And why would God let this happen? In these soul-exhausting questions, our searching for answers often threatens to lead us to a place of despair, of fear, anguish, a very poor image of God, or very poor beliefs about God. In a very challenging bit of text that's found in 1 Peter, where we'll be going here this morning, it's specifically chapter 2, the disciple Peter discusses our topic, suffering. And in verses 13 through 17, he begins a little bit softer approach into this topic. He reminds all people that they should submit, is the word he uses, themselves to leaders, okay, showing proper respect for all authorities. I meant governmental, political authorities, or spiritual authorities. He encourages the church family that they must make every effort to care for the rest of their faith family around them, and that they must love God. Okay? None of that's outrageous to us. That submit word we don't always like, but we can roll with that. But then, he takes the deep dive into our topic, and he starts here at verse 18. So this is 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18. We'll pick it up. He says, "Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering, because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Peter speaks positively of suffering, and then he goes as far as bringing up the most cruel form, unjust suffering. He says, but if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. That's one of those say what kind of moments, Peter. Like, dude, he encourages all of us to endure unjust pain and distress. Now, although my first reaction always is a say what kind of moment, like, dude, I don't think that Peter had just completely gone off the rails here either. Rather, I believe that he actually had good insights into suffering. Just consider quickly, if you know much about Peter, that he had truly suffered. He suffered physically. He was beaten. He suffered mentally and emotionally. Think about, he denied Jesus. We know that 3 times. He had to deal with that. Oof. He had suffered spiritually as well. Consider that Jesus calls him Satan. He says, get behind me, Satan. After this great moment, he has like the worst moment ever. He also got called out in the book of Acts for his prejudice against the Gentiles that were being brought into the family of faith. So Peter knew this suffering thing. And it is him who then challenges us to go in the way of Jesus and endure this suffering. Now, as we talk about this topic, I want to remind us, suffering is never some sort of good thing in itself, right? No one gets in line if that line leads to a bigger serving of pain and difficulty. Okay? We don't do that. But God is faithful nonetheless and able to work within our distress to bring about transformation. And I know that sounds really easy, and this is probably the one spot where I don't want to rush past that because that can sound very trite. It sounds too simple. But folks, I believe that it is true. And so I want us to consider this morning some of the ways that God is faithful within our difficulties. Suffering is used by God to gather us up, to get our attention, and to move us closer to Christ. I mean, time and time again, we will come across people who only begin to search deeply for truth, for meaning, for God, and for real love as a result of either suffering or some deep pain, some deep challenge in their lives. Now, I want to be clear here. Suffering was never part of God's design in creation. Okay? We don't see that initially. We talked about that in the Rhythm series just now it's been a month ago or so. Okay, but that was never the reality of what God designed. But God still gives our difficulties and our pain the room they need to draw us to his side. And C.S. Lewis captures this in his book, The Problem of Pain, which is a difficult book. He says this: God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Now, the presence of suffering also helps bring us towards a deeper maturity. The writer of the book Hebrews informs us that, and this is in 5:8, says, even though Jesus was God's Son, he learned obedience from the things he suffered. And the same author continues this thought 7 chapters later, saying that we are to endure pain and discipline for our own good. This is Hebrews 12:11. No discipline is enjoyable while it's happening. It's painful. Yep, no doubt. But afterward, there will be a peaceful harvest of right living for those who are trained in this way. And then Peter writes in the beginning of the letter that we are reading from today. He says this in chapter 1. So be truly glad. There is wonderful joy ahead, even though you must endure many trials for a little while. These trials will show that your faith is genuine. It is being tested as fire tests and purifies gold, though your faith is far more precious than mere gold. So when your faith remains strong through many trials, it will bring you much praise and glory and honor on the day when Jesus Christ is revealed to the whole world. See, suffering has the power to transform us in the direction of completeness and maturity. And the good news is that God's love is faithful enough to pull us, maybe even drag us forward. Now, God also can utilize our suffering to bring about His good purposes. And we see a really prime example of this in the life of Joseph, a familiar Old Testament reference here. Joseph suffered rejection by his family. He was sold into slavery. He was imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. For over a decade, Joseph faced relentless trials and temptations and difficulties until he became a top official in Egypt. And in pushing through and going forward through all of this suffering, Joseph was able to say, eventually, okay, he didn't write it first, his brothers, he kind of has a moment where, if you know the story, he kind of leveraged his position for a second to get a little bit of a sweet reward there maybe for himself. But eventually, this is what I love it's a real story here. This is a challenge. Eventually, he says this to his brothers. In Genesis 50, verse 20, he says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people." In the Old Testament, for many folks like a Joseph, or maybe you'd be more familiar with the story of Job, the blessings of God over their lifetimes eventually is the big word there, outpaced the sufferings that they had to go through. However, I said I really wanted to be honest this morning, and this is a bit of honesty here. The New Testament authors, they never invite us to assume that this will always be the case, or even that we'll get to some place in our lifetime where we realize this is all part of God's plan. They don't guarantee that. Instead, we are promised something even further reaching. And it's the hope of being united with Jesus Christ. The Apostle Paul alludes to this mystery, okay, and this is a mysterious union, but he talks about it in Romans chapter 8, verse 18. I want you to see this. He says, "I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us." See, I think Paul is giving us a clue as to the whereabouts of God in our suffering. So the whole of Peter's letter that we read from is addressed to the early church. And so I just want to give you that little bit of context to freshen that in your mind. This was a group that had been subjected to this endless pattern of suffering, of injustice, of social exclusion. Yet his entire epistle, the whole letter, is encouraging the church family to accept it, to be living sacrifices, to live humbly, and to live for God's purposes. Peter invites all who hear his words to rejoice in and live with the pain of unjust suffering for one reason. And it's this: it's because it is the way of God. He said this in chapter 2, verse 21. We've already read it. But he said, "To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps." Maybe that's not what you wanted to hear this morning. I didn't guarantee you that I would comfort you with any of the words this morning. I was very careful. No promises on that. Maybe this isn't what you wanted to be reminded of. Perhaps you have been longing for the Prince of Peace to ride in and save the day. But much of what is the Christian story, what is the scope of the full biblical narrative, is of a God who doesn't rush to intervene, but who suffers with. See, Jesus suffered in all the ways that we suffer. And he doesn't just know suffering like it's some abstract over here. Jesus does suffering. And sometimes knowing that God is there with us in suffering actually helps. God is not a God who is immune from pain and harm. Those who executed an innocent man on the cross intended it for evil. They intended to take a life, to wipe this thing out. But God gave the ultimate reversal for good, using this injustice to redeem and to restore and to reconcile, to be with an entire world. But that forces us to do some soul searching as followers of Jesus. We have to ask ourselves, can you accept that instant rescue and divine intervention may not be coming in the ways that you want it or the ways that you believe it should? Because if God is present in our suffering, then we too are called to embrace suffering in the way that Jesus did. And that includes the most difficult form of suffering, the kind that is unjust and undeserved. Like the painful act of carrying a cross, Peter is actually inviting us all to take a step forward by patiently enduring. Acknowledging that when it comes to suffering, we can decide to accept it, or we can just constantly buck it and try to ignore it and deny it. We can complain about it and constantly bemoan our situation, or we can keep on. We can become bitter and resentful about it, or we can seek joy and peace. He's challenging us to continue on in the person and in the pattern of Jesus, which is accomplished by way of grace, redemption, and forgiveness. This morning I want to show you just a really short clip, and this will be a familiar face to you, so I won't even tell you who it is because you'll know. But sharing just a little bit about his story. Go ahead and restart that, Miss Sue. I cut you off.
I've had some challenges in the last couple of years myself, and ultimately, I believe that suffering leads to salvation. We have to somehow accept, and not deny, but feel our suffering, and then we make one of two decisions. We either decide to go through the gate of resentment, which leads to vengeance, which leads to self-harm, which leads to harm to others, or we go through the gate of forgiveness, which leads to grace. Just as Christ did on the cross. He suffered terribly, and he was broken by it, to look upon the people who were causing that suffering, or the situation that was causing that suffering, with compassion and with forgiveness. And that's what opens the gates of heaven for all of us.
Yeah, I just wanted to show, it might have been a little hard to hear because it's just what it is there. It's Jim Carrey talking about some dark things. I mean, he's the ultimate comedian, right? Dumb and Dumber's a fantastic movie that you now will be thinking about the rest of this message. But it's going through that suffering. It's being real. It's being honest about the condition it is to be human. So how can we better accept suffering as part of life? How can we, what can we do to maintain our faith in a loving God even as we face pain and difficulties? And this is your actionable step, if you will. It's not a great actionable step, but it's to be hopefully present. Really what I mean by that is to be full of hope, even in the present. See, the great mystery of a life of faith is that it is filled with pain and suffering, and yet, present at the same time, are such great experiences and encounters of joy and peace and love. And that is a divine reminder that our problems do not mean that we are somehow outside of God's love and care, or that God has just simply left us alone. Suffering just means that we are human. Too often we get defeated by what we're facing and what we're experiencing and dealing with in the day. So then we find ourselves always rushing forward into the future. And one of the main reasons I think that we are moving so quickly to the next thing is because we're not experiencing any deep identification with God's presence and love in us and with us. And when we haven't experienced God's presence with us, here and now, in our moments, we always live under this false expectation, or maybe it's an illusion, that if we could just get past this painful, difficult, challenging moment, then things will be better. But the problem is, as long as we think that, joy and contentment are found somewhere else, someplace where there aren't difficulties, well, that means that we are never open to experience God's care and God's peace here and now. Goodness, love, and joy, even in a time of suffering, are given in the present moment, our time and in our place, which makes this moment and place, maybe even here in the sanctuary this morning, it makes this place as hopeful, as hope-filled as it can be. Scholar Thomas Merton says it like this. It says, the more that you try to avoid suffering, the more you suffer, because smaller and more insignificant things begin to torture you in proportion to your fear of being hurt. The one who does most to avoid suffering is, in the end, the one who suffers most. At the beginning of our time today, we read from Romans chapter 5. And in that, the Apostle Paul writes that we can boast in our suffering. And a better way to translate boast in this text is the word confidence. We can have confidence in our suffering, which I naturally want to say, but how and why? Consider that Jesus didn't try to avoid suffering. He didn't fight back and destroy his enemies, and he didn't duck out and just run back to heaven either. Instead, Jesus chose to stay present and to acknowledge the pain of being human and to still have confidence that God loved him enough to not leave him alone in his suffering. See, it is in God's eternal and his extravagant love that we can suffer in hope. It's a love that will never leave us, even on the days where it sure feels that way. And then, in our present messy, we'll call them, forms of goodness, joy, truth, hope, beauty, and peace, we can offer one another that same love and presence that we have received from God. Because blessed are those who suffer, because they do not suffer alone. I mentioned last week that each end of our messages through the season of Lent will kind of finish with a blessing. This one today is from Kate Bowler again. She's a professor and writer. And it's a blessing for when it's too much to handle. God, our bodies remember the sleepless nights and cold sweats and unrelenting stress. Show us how to process all that we suffer. Job 14:1 says, "How frail is humanity, how short is life, how full of trouble." Blessed are we when we decide to make room for all of it, the fear and the gratitude, the complexity and the suffering. Blessed are we who pour out to you the whole of it, unedited, all the terrible truths and fears and what ifs. The gratitude for those beautiful hearts in action who came willingly into the strange and awkward space that is my need. Blessed are we, learning as humans together that pain is inevitable. Nurses are wonderful. Hospitals are loud. People are brave. And we grow and we hurt and we heal. And then we do it all over again. Because this beautiful paradox is what it means to be human. Would you pray with me?